Welcome to Influences Podcast. Today on the show, I have DJ Mark Farina. And DJ Mark Farina is one of Chicago house music's greats who has been spinning house beats, acid jazz, and mushroom jazz for over 30 years. He's crisscrossed the globe many times and is loyal and respectful to his fans. He's one of the most accessible DJs. Mark, welcome to Influences Podcast.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So to start off, Mark, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you got into DJing.
Um, yeah, let's see. I mean, back to the beginning would be the 80s. Born and raised in Chicago, so that unknowingly at the time, until I got a bit older, was like a great place to be around DJs. And in terms of almost any cities you could be, Chicago in the 80s was about as good as you could be. So it was a lot of DJ culture emerging in Chicago, and um, growing up there and being into at first before house music and before seeing the first DJ play, I would, into like industrial new wave kind of music in my early high school years, this
Yep.
being around 1984. I want to say eighth grade so much. I wasn't, I was buying records, but my tastes in high school, you start to get more refined and learning about the artists and getting into the music. So yeah, getting into new wave in Chicago in that era was a great place. When we'd go to a record store called Wax Trax Records, which was famous industrial new wave label, based in Chicago, and we would make treks down to that store, and at the same time in this 1984 85 range, we started going to teen clubs in Chicago. So and that's where we saw our first DJs. We would hear mixes, because even at that time in that early 80s there was mixes on the radio in Chicago, house mixes on major stations, so you could tune in at almost any day of the week. There was like the mix at 6 and a lunch mix on like two main stations called WGCI and WBMX in Chicago in that 80s era, so you could listen to DJs mixing. But when we went to these teen clubs, like, and still a thing that changed a lot. At first, a lot of back in that day, the DJ booth was hidden somewhere. It wasn't like front and center, more so like it is today.
Yeah, because I
So
find it's really interactive today. Like when I was at the box for your after party in Toronto, like you were pretty good with me coming right up and taking a look at what you were doing. So yeah, I guess it was a little different back in the 80s.
yeah, like it would be a room that side somewhere with a door, and like it wasn't as accessible as today. It would be like you sort of had to know somebody to get in there. Usually, like, you couldn't just freely walk into a DJ booth. But yeah, we started going to these clubs and we saw a DJ playing for the first time, and we were like, oh, that's how they do it. Like,
Yeah.
like once you see the turntables and the mixer and the equipment they're using and how they're doing it, obviously this is pre YouTube and pre
Yeah.
cell phone and all that. So to see things, you had to actually be there to see them.
Yeah.
So we saw a DJ, we're like, oh wow, that's how it works. And so we were sort of into it right away because we were already buying records and things at the time, at the time. So we were like, all right, that makes sense. And then we found like or we learned that one of my friends who we were clubbing with at the time, he's like, I think my dad has a DJ mixer, because his dad would like do these toga party things and like get on this microphone and like introduce songs. And like we wouldn't go to these, obviously it was adult parties, and we were just starting high school. But he's like, I think my dad has a mixer, and it turned out he had
Yeah.
some little Radio Shack mixer, in on their little stereo system. That everybody had a little stereo system at the time, but not everybody had a mixer. So we're like, wow, he has a mixer. So then like I brought one of my turntables over to his house. And back then, it was when people had sort of a component system where you'd have tape deck, receiver, turntable, amp, and speakers all in one, setup. So we brought this other turntable from my little setup over, and we started messing around. And
Yeah.
obviously we didn't have pitch or anything. You'd use your finger to speed up and slow down, which was tricky and all that. So yeah, that's how we our early days of getting into it. And then from then, like I found a cheap mixer, and I would just mix, from my cassette. I, plugged my stereo stuff into the mixer. So I had just a cassette player and a turntable
Right.
into a mixer. And I would record stuff on the cassette and mix out of it with the turntable, none of which had any pitch control or anything. So that's how we began back then.
Okay, so what inspired you to start DJing house, or Chicago house? Because that's kind of, you know, how I picture you as a DJ, and I'm a
Yeah.
huge
I mean,
fanboy of yours too, right? So this is
yeah,
quite the honor having you on the show. So
my pleasure.
I,
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So like I said, growing up in Chicago was a blessing because we got to hear all this house music, and I would sit there on cassette and, record house mixes, and this would be the likes of the Hot Mix Five or Farley Jackmaster Funk,
yeah,
like Mike Hitman Wilson, Mickey Oliver, Ralphie Rosario, Steve Hurley, Fast Eddie. I'm trying to think all the people that were on Julian Jumping Perez, guys like that were
yeah,
all on the radio at the
right,
time, and I would sit there and record bits of the mix. And I think at that time, like I said, I was coming from an industrial new wave angle. I used to like not all like I wouldn't. I wish I had done it now, but back then I used to just record pieces of the mix because I didn't like all of it. Like sometimes if it was too vocally disco, when I was early on, I wasn't. I liked the more tracky acid track kind of
yeah,
early Detroit influence stuff. So and we were going to this club in Chicago, that would like in all the industrial music that I listened to back then was all beat matched, similar to house. So like everything was blended, like it wasn't just playing songs. So we got into mixing, off the bat. And then once we learned where to buy house records in Chicago, which was the next step, like, oh, you have to learn what these records are and then find them. So we just started
yeah,
buying, early Chicago house, like Trax records. And like I said, I used to like a lot of the more tracky, like acid track, all the early acid track stuff. And then I discovered Detroit techno. I mean, there was a certain song, came out around 85. I want to say, it would be a Model 500, No UFOs, which
okay,
was, old Juan Atkins, Detroit techno. And that would cross over into the industrial new wave scene in Medusa's, this club that we would go to. So there are certain songs that would be kind of housey that would get played in this, industrial new wave thing. So I started to get, into stuff like that. And as I learned where it was, I discovered Little Lewis and started buying, like luckily, we found there's a couple stores, like in this would be around 88, 89.
right,
Like once you find a couple record stores that carried house records, and this was back, early on where, a lot of the Chicago producers, they'd bring, the boxes of records out of their trunk to the stores direct. So Chicago had a fortunate geographic house music bonus, so you could find records in which like that, and that would be where I met Derek Carter when he was working at the record store he was working at by the university I started going to. In that would have been 88. He was working at a store, Imports, etc., which was like I would walk from the train to the college in downtown Chicago and pass this record store, and I'm like,
yeah,
oh, I got to check this out. And and then I started learning, oh, this is where you get these records, and it'd be like, in Imports was a great store to find early on because it's where like Frankie worked there early on, and they just had a great, of course Derek was working there. He had a wall of his, back then it was in a record store, DJs
yeah,
had sections on the wall of their picks,
yeah.
and I ended up gravitating to Derek's picks, and he was working the counter and would check me out, and I'm like, and that's where we met. So yeah, growing from that, and then I started to get more and more into house, and that 89 was sort of rain, like where I started to not be into industrial so much and just learning where all this new house stuff was.
Right.
So that's, and that's where I started buying house records.
So you and
And
Derek
yeah,
kind of came up together on the house music scene in Chicago.
kind of. I mean, like, Chicago is vaguely north side and south side, and he was
Yeah.
generally a little bit more on the south. And from an equal suburb kind of west of Chicago as me, but he had been doing DJ stuff before I met him. Like he was
Yeah.
already, making records at that time, and DJ, like, he started DJing like his family parties, playing
Okay.
disco like when he was younger. So he was already,
He was already well into it.
pretty, yeah, he was doing his thing already. So yeah, and then that's where we learned, like, I learned to, how house records were made through him, because he was already, he had some drum machines and things he was working with at the time. And so yeah, and he was obviously a wealth of knowledge of disco. So, and that's like coming from my white suburban thing, I didn't know all the disco stuff back then. I was coming from more like a rock, like I was into Rush and the Police before new wave. So like my junior high would be like Rush, Police, and that kind of thing. So I didn't grow up knowing disco, funk, soul until later. So yeah,
That
Derek
that's
was doing his thing.
that's the thing, being a Canadian guy here and growing up with stuff like Rush. I'm really impressed that Rush was actually an influence for you. Um, did any of that help your journey? So listening to Rush, like, and
Um, yeah, I mean, I think so. That was my first concert was Rush in 1981, the Moving Pictures tour.
yeah,
I was
yeah,
in sixth grade. So, I mean, I was a Rush fan, Neil Peart fan, and just, I think the rhythms obviously were important. And, I was playing trumpet at that time and, I was in concert band and symphony.
yeah,
So learning what do you call it? And it's escaping me, like the measures, like different timekeeping, like 4/4 time, 3/4 time, 6/8,
yeah,
and learning all those time, like learning all that kind of stuff, was
yep,
important.
right.
I think, and just in terms of and I just loved, like Rush was my thing for early years of my existence. So yeah, I think rhythmically and musically, it all was just building blocks to going forward.
That's awesome. So going back about who helped you break into the industry, is it fair to say that it was Derek? Like, how did you break in
Um,
to the industry?
yeah, I mean, we both kind of hadn't broken in. Like he was just making records, and we were just starting to play each of us, clubs in Chicago at that time. Like it
Right.
was just a new thing, and DJs were just starting to play. And also another thing back then, which was different, like DJs back then, you would almost play. DJs would play all night, in one room or whatever. So it wasn't like today with multiple DJs on bills and things. So you sort of had to try out for a night. Like this night was opening at this club on, say, like Thursdays is opening at Foxy's or something. So you send in some tapes. So we were
Yeah.
just trying to get our footing and get nights. And the DJs were the promoters back then too. There were no promoters. So
Yeah.
we were each kind of trying to all do our own side hustle, and we were the younger generation in terms
Right.
of,
Right.
we were, I was like 17, 18 in that range, like the other house DJs that were established, like the Hot Mix Five, Ralphie Rosario,
Right.
Farley,
Right.
Julian Perez, they were on the radio. Bad Boy Bill, they were established already. They were like
Yeah.
sort of doing their thing, and then there was record labels doing stuff. But we were sort of the younger kids. Some other guys like Spencer Kinsey, Gemini was another one of our friends. Diz, Heather. Um, I'm trying to think of the other club DJs, at that time. So yeah, we were sort of a like a new generation
So you would play all
of club
night, right?
DJs.
You would play
Hmm.
you would play all night when it first began, because I was
Yeah, when
talking
we
to
first began, it was, you would get Thursday night or Friday night or whatever, and you'd play 9 to 4 or 3 or whatever,
because
and yeah, so
I was talking to Jay Newfunk, and he said that you're very versatile when it comes to DJing, and I've seen you a couple times pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and that's the one thing, like, you could throw down a Jamiroquai, Michael Jackson set, and then the last show I saw you at, it was primarily house music. So I mean, that's something that's really interesting when I go see you play. So I'm going to move on to, how do you think you influence the genre of house music?
um gee, I mean, yeah, I'm one of the fortunate, like, along with Derek, and there's a few other of us like Doc Martin, and there's a list of, DJs that have been sort of doing it since the beginning of DJing. So yeah, fortunate to be, in the right time and place to be around DJs, and like we were sort of the first group of traveling DJs, at that time, like just in that early, like around 1990 was when, DJs started to play in other cities, and it was definitely a new thing, like before that, it was sort of geographic. You would just stay in your area generally. So yeah, being able to, just start early helped, and being around, the house people, and then consistency wise, just doing it for so long, as knock on wood, that a lot of DJs come and go. think like the industry is fickle. It's a hard thing to get a foothold. So, being able to do it for so long has helped. And, I would say early on too, in that early 90s range, there was a group of like, or just DJs, you could get a lot of DJ work from just DJ. You didn't have to make records, so to speak. You could just sort of get DJ gigs. And then also I think doing mix CDs in that 90s period helped get my sound out a bit. Obviously, there's mixtapes that was going on, but I think the actual mix CD format in that 90s era was, important. Like if you weren't making a lot of records, to get your sound to different countries and places, like doing United DJs of America and then a lot of the
Right.
home compilations, allowed me to play different cities that I wouldn't have been able to play if I, didn't, sort of do those mix CDs.
Yeah. I
So
think
yeah, fortunate to
I
be,
think that
doing it for so long.
yeah, absolutely. But I also think you're a very crowd-friendly DJ and a fan-friendly DJ as well. I saw you at a show pre-pandemic, 2017, 2018 in Toronto. And it was the first time I saw you. And you before your set, you came out around 11:30. I think your set was at 12. And you kind of worked the room. You checked out the speakers, the sound, and the vibe. I'm just wondering, is that part of your pre-show ritual?
Um,
I didn't see
yeah,
you do that at the last jam, and I'm thinking it was attributed to traffic because I remember that night being pretty hectic with the traffic and even getting to the club.
yeah, yeah. That was because there was not much time in between sets, and I'd been in that room before. So yeah, but each new room though, you kind of always got to get like a lay of the land, like scope it out. If I know the DJ before, ideally you like to get there like a good hour, an hour before to sort of feel it out and see what's going on.
Yeah,
But even set wise, like you check out the room, how's the sound, because that's the whole other element of, DJing that maybe isn't talked about as much as pure selection is how a DJ interacts with the sound system and the equipment and volume. Like obviously, it doesn't matter like in terms of certain things that it doesn't matter what genre you're playing. There's certain elements that all DJs have to deal with, in terms of the equipment, the crowd, how's it sound, how's the booth, how are the monitors, and all that. So any chance you can get to check that out, is useful.
well,
Obviously,
even saying hello to the people. I mean, no one does
yeah,
it like that. That's fantastic. Like I, I,
and,
I felt the kinship right away. I mean, I went out of my way to walk up to you and like
yeah.
there's a kinship with the audience as well, which I
Oh,
don't
yeah, and
find
I've
a
always,
lot of DJs do that, right? So that's why I asked you the question if that's something you do all the time.
yeah. I mean, generally, I always hang out. I like to hear the sound on the floor and say, hey, like try and get a perspective different than the booth. In
Okay.
some rooms, maybe you've been in that room more than once or whatever. But even on a new night, things change from the same room to the next time you're there. Yeah, I'm always trying to hang out, not I don't just you don't just want to go with tunnel vision straight to the booth. Like I said, even though now the booth is on the front lines of stuff, people can you could still sort of just go in and there's always a little backstage or something, or you can just go to the booth and stay there.
Yeah.
Um, it's nice to check different rooms. Although sometimes, like a festival, for example, like that earlier set that day at the park, it's harder to go out
No, yeah.
and
Oh yeah.
especially while you're when you're like you have to do that a lot earlier because it's hard to get back and forth from the floor to the DJ booth if it's like a festival or a different setup. So yeah, I always and even in terms of playing, you like to hear what's going on in some place, see what people are digging, and
Yeah.
I'm not I'm not a DJ that has any sort of set that I'm gonna start with this song tonight. Like you never you
Well,
don't
that's
really
the other
know
thing I
that.
was
I
gonna
think
ask. If you got a set list in mind, or is it something like you feel
no.
out the crowd and then you go with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's always geographic. Like Toronto, just for example, like the earlier set and later set, are two different mindsets. Like playing earlier at a park, it's a different crowd than a Toronto club crowd. So I'm going to go in with different, sort of whatever parameters. But no, I just bring, new and old stuff that I'm into, and you see where that goes. And I used to know DJs. Some DJs that maybe hadn't been playing as long as me or whatever that have like, their set list and like they're going to start with this song and, they might even know what they're going to play 2, 3 songs in a row, but that's never the case with me. I don't even know what I'm going to play until the last song of the guy, is playing before me.
Yeah.
Or sometimes, like if like sometimes in advance if there's going to be silence before your set in this day and age of festivals and different kinds of acts with different gear.
Yeah.
Like sometimes, you're not like sometimes you're going to be mixing on the same equipment that the other DJ is playing, and you're going to do something different as opposed to like, oh, they got to move, this guy's gear over, and you got to start from scratch. So that creates a different sort of element if you're starting from silence.
Right.
So, but I always you feel the room out. You never know what you're going to play until
the times I've seen you mix out of whoever the last DJ is. So yeah.
I generally that's my preference. I like to keep the vibe going.
Yeah, no, I love that because some DJs just fade out the last DJ and then go into their set.
Yeah, or they got some intro or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
It can be a bit weird.
So my last question, I told you I'm a fanboy of you, but I'm also a fanboy of Depeche Mode, and I know you're a fan of Depeche Mode as well. Will you ever do a Depeche Mode remix? Why or why not?
Oh, yeah, I would. I've used acapellas and done on the fly a little because I have a couple acapellas of Depeche Mode. Yeah, I love Depeche Mode. Although I haven't seen them in a few years, but I used to, I've seen them a good 7 times or so, maybe. I don't even know.
They're awesome now. I went to the show here in Toronto in April. They're still awesome, man. They're in their 60s and they're still, kicking it. And they're coming back to Toronto in November. I'm going to go see that show. But I'm always waiting on your SoundCloud account, your Mixcloud account. I'm like, is there a Depeche Mode mix? I'd love to hear it.
I'll work on that because I do have a couple of good acapellas of theirs.
Yeah, that'd be awesome, man. Mark, thank you so much for doing this. I've been anticipating this all month, and I'm so glad you came on the show. Thank you so much. I wish you well.
Thanks for having me. Tonight. Thanks for being patient. And yeah, that Europe trip sort of was I get a bit hectic going to Europe because there's always a lot of stuff to take care of. So
I was willing to wait.
Thank you. Thank you for fitting me in.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. You have been watching and listening to Influences Podcast. Influences Podcast is written, produced, and hosted by yours truly, Jason Harischuk. Also produced by Angela Churchill, aka Purple Sapphire. My social media consultant is Christina Laukinen, also known as My Girl Tuesday. Check out Influences Podcast on Instagram and TikTok at influences_podcast. That's influences_podcast. Thanks for watching and listening.